Good evening. My name is Terry Tornick, and I'm the City Council member from District 7. It's my happy job to welcome you all on behalf of Mayor Bogard and the City Council to this One City, One Story event. This Bible is open to Isaiah 8:16. I wonder if there's any consequence to that. It's really a privilege to participate in this, the 11th version of our community reading program, for several reasons. First, I think the event is fun. Not all of the city events and programs are as interesting or as fun as this one is. Second, I think it reinforces the central role that our public library plays in our city. This is a role that is recognized by our citizens, having approved a special tax not once but 3 times since 1993. That's not all very common, but it does add credence to the central role that our library plays in the life of this city. Finally, and most important, this event and all the activities that are in your program that surround it, ranging from gardening to astronomy, help to reinforce the community ties that maintain Pasadena as a great city. We usually define our city in terms of its wonderful buildings, its institutions, the Rose Bowl and Caltech and Old Pasadena and the Arroyo and our wonderful urban forest, the kinds of things that people notice physically about Pasadena that set it apart. But really, it's the human interactions that I think really define our city, and it's activities like this that reintroduce people to their neighbors and to people they've never met before on an interpersonal level. So let me extend my thanks on behalf of the mayor and the city council to Jan and the library staff, to all the participants in this whole array of activities that have been happening and will be happening over the next week, to the selection committee that participated in choosing this wonderful book and author, and of course to our author, Karen Thompson Walker, for her wonderful book and her participation in this event. And I would also like to thank her parents, who were kind enough to join us tonight. So please enjoy your evening and continue to enjoy our city. And I'll now turn it over to Jan Sanders and the rest of your program. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Councilmember Tornick, and thanks to each of you for coming to spend an evening with us in conversation with our gifted author this year. Before we get too far into the program, I do want to take just a minute to recognize all those individuals who spend countless hours reading and discussing and rereading and arguing over and defending particular choices before we get to the final selection of our One City, One Story title. So if you're a member of that august body and you are with us tonight, would you please rise and let us thank you? I saw Brian Berry come in. Jolly. Thank you so much. These people put in a lot of time and energy to make this happen, so we are very grateful for them and for their support. And we're also grateful for the support of all of our sponsors. And one of our lead sponsors continues to be the members of the Friends of Pasadena Libraries. This is a very large group that does wonderful, wonderful things for the libraries in Pasadena. They have a wide range of membership. And here to speak just a little bit about becoming a member of the Friends of the Pasadena Library is their chair of membership, John Price. Where's John? Oh, he sneaked up on me.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll agree that if you have a really good friend, that's a wonderful thing. If you're a library in Pasadena, you now have a little over 500 good friends. As Jan said, we call them the Friends of the Pasadena Public Library. We do a large number of funding for events and helping to fund events. We even stage a few events, and we take care of bits and pieces of things that go on at Central Library and the 10 branches, the 9 branches. Let me just give you a thumbnail of one of these things that we fund. If you're in a library in, it's either October or November, at the right time, you're liable to see a group of very excited young children coming out of wherever they have the children's story time. Each one of them will be carrying a little book. It's a fairly simple little paperback. But remember that in some cases, this is the first book that this child owns. If we follow that book home with this kid, we'll find that it gets read and read again until it's dog-eared, and probably read aloud to a younger sister or brother. And pretty soon, that young reader is marching off to their library, branch or central, with their own library card, and explaining to their brother or sister that when they can read, they can check out books too. Can you think of a better way to induce early reading among children? And the books are funded by the Friends. How do we fund things? Well, we do it with our monthly book sales. Second Saturday of every month at the patio at Central, 9 to noon. If it rains, we keep the books dry. You can get there and stay dry however you can. We fund it with proceeds from our bookstore, which is in the passageway that goes to the patio. And of course, best of all, we fund it with the membership donations from our members. Little memberships, big memberships, lots of memberships. The more members we have, the more we can do for the libraries. And tonight when you leave, there will be a member of our board at the exit to give you a copy of our latest newsletter, which tells you things we've done recently. And if you are interested, you can also pick up a copy of our membership brochure, which lists all of the things that we do. So the mission of the Friends is to support the library's programs, special services, and cultural events. Priority is given to projects that instill the excitement of discovery and love of reading in library patrons of all ages. We'd love to have you be a friend of the Pasadena Public Libraries. Thanks.
Thank you, John, and thank you, members of the Friends, for all the volunteer time and energy you give to us. We certainly appreciate that. And now let's get down to the real event of the evening, a conversation with our author. After a lot of serious conversation, the selection committee chose The Age of Miracles as our read for this year, our 11th year of the One City, One Story program. And as you know, one of the things that we try to do with that selection is to either choose someone who has a tie to Southern California, or where the story has a tie to Southern California, or it is of immediate and compelling interest to us as Southern Californians. Well, we sort of hit the daily double this year, because not only did we choose a book whose plot is set in Southern California, but we have chosen an author who is originally from San Diego. I know it's not Pasadena, but it's close. It's close. Could have been San Francisco. That would be farther away. So we were delighted when we began talking to Karen about coming to join us for this evening's events and the many events that happen today and tomorrow surrounding One City, One Story. I think if you have not met her, you may be, as I was, surprised at how very young she is. Now, I realize that this white hair makes everybody look young to me. I get that. But she is very young for an accomplished author. And as we were talking today, her book has not even been published for 1 year. It's that new. We were comparing stories a little bit because in my travels, I've noticed that The Age of Miracles has been featured in a number of airports. And Karen laughed and said, "That's when you know you've made it, when you're in the airports." So I saw it in the Oakland airport, in the LAX, and in the Chicago airport as well. So you're familiar with the story. We're going to talk a little bit about her writing style and the story itself and a number of other concerns and themes that I have in mind. You will have time to ask questions yourself as the evening progresses. So if you have not had a chance to write down your question, I hope that you will do that. Someone from the library staff will collect them. But for now, please help me warmly welcome Karen Thompson Walker.
Thank you.
Ta-da!
Which side do you want?
Either side. What's your best side? We're on TV. Pick your best side.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
I'm glad
is
to be
great,
here.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it fun? So, your book. I know. We've talked a little bit today with other members of Pasadena about your book and sort of how it came to be. I think the first question that everybody wants to know is where you got this crazy idea. So tell us a little bit about that. It's a fascinating story.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I got the idea from something that really happened. This was back in 2004, the earthquake that caused the tsunami in Indonesia that year. I read that earthquake was so powerful that it actually did affect the rotation of the Earth. And so after that day, our 24-hour days were a fraction of a second shorter. And I remember kind of right where I was when I heard that detail, because it sort of scared me, to think that something I had thought of as kind of the definition of certainty. Every day the sun rises at a stable and predictable time.
I like to think so.
Yeah. The idea that was actually in flux was scary to me, and I started to wonder right away, what would we do? How would we react? What would happen to the planet if a much, much larger shift were to take place in the rotation of the Earth? So that was the first kernel.
Uh-huh. And then you researched?
Yeah, and then, well, first I wrote a short story about that premise that was only like 14 pages long. And I did a little bit of research for that, and then I set it aside for a few years. And it was when I came back to it a few years later that I thought, well, maybe this could be a novel. And then I started to do more research, yeah.
So did the short story contain most of the elements that we find in the book? Was it the same cast of characters, that kind of thing?
It was a similar cast of characters. It definitely had Julia, the main character, and the voice of Julia, the adult Julia, looking back in very close detail on childhood. And so it had this combination of, this voice that's looking back on a pivotal time in her personal life, sixth grade, and also, of course, a pivotal time in the sort of history of the Earth in this world.
Let's talk about that a little bit. What made you choose her particular voice for this story? I mean, I would have thought, maybe someone, I don't know, older and a little more jaded, perhaps a scientific point of view, but an 11-year-old young girl who has all kinds of miracles she's trying to make happen on her own.
Right. I didn't give it a lot of conscious thought right at the beginning, but I just knew right away, as soon as I heard that news about the rotation of the Earth, and I sat down and tried to write this short story, and the voice that came to me was an adult looking back on childhood. And I think that was it was partly a way of making sure that I could tell this big, big global story in a way that would feel hopefully really personal and in that sense real, I hoped. And I thought if you focus on a young girl and her point of view is sort of narrow, but it's very close up on ordinary people, I thought that would be interesting. And the other thing is, I think I love books that have that perspective in general of an adult looking back on their childhood. And I think there's something about that narrative voice and that perspective that is always a little nostalgic. It's always a person talking about their childhood is always a person talking about this kind of lost era, a lost time and place of childhood. And so that voice felt right for a book in which, Julia is looking back not only on the lost era of her childhood, but also the lost era of, ordinary life on planet Earth.
Yeah, and right away from the very first sentence that she's in the future looking back.
Right.
We didn't notice right away, we couldn't feel it.
Right.
It's pretty captivating story for a beginning, I think.
Oh, thank you.
I was thinking through some other works. I was taken by the way that you use very ordinary events and ordinary details to really build the story. I remember at one point you made the comment, or someone made the comment, Julia's father they were sitting around having dinner, and Julia's father had his napkin across his lap and ate his pizza with a knife and fork. And I thought, now that's a specific detail that not everyone would know. But I was kind of intrigued by your use of the ordinary. It brought to mind to me, and maybe this is a stretch, maybe you won't follow me on this, but we'll give it a shot. It brought to mind Thornton Wilder's play Our Town.
Oh, interesting.
When Emily, you remember when Emily goes to heaven and then she asks to come back for one day, and Mrs. Gibbs, her mother-in-law, says to her, "Don't do it, Emily, it's too painful, but if you must, choose a very unimportant day.
Oh, yeah.
Choose a day that doesn't really matter that much."
Interesting.
Did you think consciously about the juxtaposition between the ordinary and the very extraordinary as you were writing this?
You know, I think that one of the sort of exciting things about kind of coming across this premise, writing about this huge sort of strange disaster.
Cosmic.
Yeah. It was a way of writing about ordinary life that felt to me more visceral and exciting than it would have before. So I was able to use, just kind of sensory details from my, fairly ordinary suburban California childhood. But suddenly, in this context, all those ordinary details seem to have more meaning because every ordinary life is, when you write about a story in which ordinary life is under threat, all those ordinary details start to seem more precious and I think more interesting and more profound. At least that's the way I felt as I wrote the book. And I think, the further I got into the book, the more I realized that this was a story, even though it has this extraordinary premise, it really is a story about ordinary life. And I wanted to render it as sort of vividly as possible. And I think Julia is trying to render her memories of ordinary life as vividly as possible because some of those things have fallen away in the time that she's writing.
Right, and the farther we go into the story, the more extraordinary things get layered on and on and on, down to at the very end when they have the, metal sheets encasing each of the homes to keep the radiation out.
Right, because of the change in the magnetic field, more radiation is getting through.
Right.
So.
Well, you indicated that now you're living in Iowa.
That's right.
Nice state of Iowa. But you grew up here in Southern California in San Diego. How much of the story how would the story have been different? Could you have written the story and put it in Iowa? Or did it sort of have to happen in Southern California?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was writing the book, I was living in New York City. And
so you were homesick.
yeah, I think I was saying earlier to someone earlier tonight that I think I realized that when I moved to New York, after spending my first 23 years in California, I moved to New York to get an MFA, and it was in New York that that was when I started to be able to see what was interesting and what was different about California. Like suddenly all the details, like the eucalyptus trees or the way that the ocean smells or, just all those kind of ordinary details. It was suddenly easier for me to see those details.
You needed that distance?
Yeah, I think so. And because then I was thinking about California and I could tell suddenly what made it unique because now I had this perspective of living in a different place. So I think that
okay, I see that.
That was part of why I set it in California. And certainly, it's the story of a young girl. She's 11 years old, and it made sense for me to set the book in the place where I was 11 because there's so many details from childhood that are so specific that it would be much harder to imagine what it would be like to be a child in New York City because I haven't been a child in New York City. So at first it was just convenient, but I think there's also something about a Californian's sense of natural disaster that I think also.
What does that mean, California's sense of national disaster?
Oh, I just mean.
You walked into that one. What does that mean?
I think for me, growing up in California, and it's not the only place on the planet, but certainly growing up in California, you have a a strong sense of the power of natural disaster from an early age, and you know that even if it doesn't happen to you, you know that an earthquake could strike and change your life in an instant, and growing up, I remember, doing earthquake drills at school, or,
Of course.
I think I told this story at school earlier today, but about how once, I think it was 92, there was 2 earthquakes in the same day, and something about that combination led some experts to say that there was an increased chance of the big one striking, later that same day or the next 24 hours. And I just remember that day really vividly, and it sort of scared me, but it also means that it just gave me this sense, I think from a young age, of what it feels like to know that those disasters are possible. But at the same time, maybe even more interestingly, it gave me a sense of how much you adapt to that, and how most of the time in California we don't think about, earthquakes
That's
or brush
true.
fires.
That's
And
true.
I think that helped me imagine, in my book, these characters who are on the one hand living with this very frightening and sudden and huge sort of radical uncertainty, but at the same time, to some extent, they're able to adapt and carry on with ordinary life. And I think there was something about growing up in California that showed me how good human beings are at that skill.
Maybe we're more resilient. Maybe you're more resilient for
Maybe.
having grown up here. You're right, with the threat of, this could be the big one.
Yeah,
every time you
the
turn
combination
around.
of knowing.
I grew up in the Midwest. It was always a tornado,
Yeah.
but not quite so dramatic.
Right. Well, everywhere has their. Well, not everywhere. Most places.
Most
have a,
places. Most places.
have a natural disaster.
Well, and also, the role of the ocean and the tides and, the beaching of the whales and all that. Huh?
Yeah.
You sort of played into that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I just tried to use the environment that I remember so vividly from childhood, and the beach was certainly one of those things. And imagining that there's something so frightening about the changes in the ocean, and so. I put that the whales begin to beach themselves, and the tides change, so the waterfront mansions get flooded. And I was certainly picturing the mansions that are, in San Diego, and
Yeah, or
Malibu. Yeah,
Could have been Malibu.
yeah,
I noticed that throughout the book there seems to be sort of a recurrent theme of almost renewals or returns or whatever. You have a number of characters who sort of leave and then come back. I wonder, before we get too deeply into that, I'm wondering about the story of, who was it, Julia's grandfather's brother that was lost, and then he turned up in Sweden
his
or whatever
uncle
it
in
was.
Norway.
Yeah, okay, Norway. Tell us a little bit about where that came from. Was there a particularly salient point that you wanted to make?
Yeah, it's interesting that no one has pointed that out to me before.
Really?
The returns, but you're right. There's a lot of them.
There's a lot of returns.
Yeah.
A lot of returns.
It's so interesting when you publish a book, because then people will give you these readings of your book that are so true and accurate, and yet I didn't even know that I'd done that. So you're right, there are a lot. So that particular story, it's Julia's grandfather's uncle disappeared in Alaska, but then 20 years later, her grandfather, he tells a story about how he thinks he saw him on a bus in Norway. And that is a story that's a family story that comes from, the grandfather character is somewhat based on my real grandfather, and he used to tell a story that, it's not exactly that, but very similar, that he did have an uncle who disappeared in a boat in Alaska, but my grandfather was always convinced that that he didn't really disappear. He wasn't really lost at sea. But he really did.
Really?
My grandfather really did believe that he saw him in Norway once. And the thing I remember my grandfather saying was that he saw him on the bus. He was on a bus, and then he noticed that his uncle, who he hadn't seen in, 10 years maybe, he was sure that he was on the bus with him. And then when his uncle saw him, he got off the bus and just, as I remember the story, he just walked into the woods. And at that point in the story, my grandfather, which I think I put in the book, he would say, that would be just like him. That would be just like him. And I always thought, like, what kind of person was this uncle that's what he would do? But yeah, that story, it was kind of a great family story, so I put it in the book.
Well, it's interesting. And then of course you have the departure of Hannah, and then she returns
Yeah.
a very different person. What's the talk to us a little bit about Hannah as a character.
So Hannah is Julia's, sort of best
Former
friend.
best friend.
Yeah, at the start of the book, she's her best friend. But so her family is Mormon, and at the very beginning, when this news comes out, people are afraid it's going to be the end of the world, and different people react in different ways, and I think especially religious people have different religious ideas about what the meaning of this is, and so. Hannah's family, partly for religious reasons and also just to be near her family, Hannah's family packs up and leaves California and goes to be with their family in Utah. Right. And so that leaves Julia sort of suddenly exposed and lonely without her friend there. And that was just, and then when she returns, they've sort of, they can't connect again, and she's made a new good friend, and I think that sort of rung true for me as my memories of middle school.
I think that's a very typical female middle school kind of thing to go on.
I mean, not so much the leaving for Utah, but the sudden rupture of close friendships. Suddenly everything can change. So that was partly just something that I remembered from middle school and seemed true, but it was also a way of, in Julia's case, she's sort of haunted by this question of how many things that happen in her life, like the loss of that friendship, are the result of this slowing, this huge catastrophe, and how much of it is just ordinary life. And it's kind of an unknowable question. So in the case of Hannah, would they have, had a falling out or grown apart anyway, or is it because of this catastrophe?
Hard to say.
Yeah.
Hard to say. And I thought it was, I liked the way you sort of brought in a little bit of religious fervor, but didn't let yourself go too far down that road. There's a little bit about, how the Mormons would have reacted. There were one or two, as I'm remembering it, there were one or two sidewalk preachers that made some, well, of course, the gentleman who got hit by that her mother hit was, but you didn't really get into that a lot. I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Yeah, it just seemed true to me that, that at a time where people are afraid they're facing, the end of the world, or at least the end of human life as we know it, it seemed like a time where religion would be especially important to people. But it was kind of interesting to try to imagine how different religions would respond.
Yeah. Why Age of Miracles?
The title. I get that's a question that I always get. I chose the title early when I only had about 40 pages of it written. And I heard it in a song. It's a Billie Holiday song, or at least the version that I know. She sings it. And I liked the phrase right away, and I felt like it might fit for my book because it has a couple of sort of double meanings. My book is really, equally sort of the story of global catastrophe, but also the story about growing up. And so I liked the idea that the word age could have this double meaning, Julia's age, she's 11, a time in life, but also age as in an era in the history of the planet. And then miracles, I certainly meant in kind of a looser than usual way. It's not in the religious way and not even exactly in the positive way, but I thought of a miracle as an event that happens that breaks with our rules, the rules of reality as we understand them. And so I think certainly the sudden slowing of the rotation of the Earth in a way that no one expects or understands is sort of miraculous in the sense of it's extraordinary and awe-inspiring and seemingly impossible. And then in a different way, I feel like adolescence or middle school is in the book I called it the age of miracles, because it's a time when things are changing so quickly that it seems almost impossible. Friendships are forming very quickly and they can fall apart very quickly. First love, kids are just growing at sort of seemingly impossible speeds, and I think there's something sort of miraculous about that.
It is. And then at one point later in the book, someone's trying to create miracle rice. There's a line in there about miracle rice.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Wasn't it rice?
It was rice, that could grow. They're trying to develop rice that could grow without light, which could be important as these, as the rotation of the Earth slows down, the days get very long and the nights get very long. So in case they need to be able to grow rice, in the dark. That's the idea.
So I want to look a little bit at the pacing of the book, because I found the pacing really kind of intriguing and very interesting. You have the natural pace of the story itself, because you're talking about day and night, and that has its own, or until then, had its own ebb and flow and a sort of natural way of things to progress. And then there's that conversation between the real-timers and the, what are they, clock people?
Clock timers.
And the
yeah.
clock timers, about how pace in their life is altered based on their interpretation. Talk to us a little bit about how you came to that pacing. It seems to me like that would be a very difficult sort of element to put into a book. How do you know when you have the pacing right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that's one of the hardest things for sure. But it's also, for me, one of the most important things to me. You know, my favorite thing is a book, when I come across a book that is, you know, not only well-written, but also has a really gripping story. Those are my favorite books. And so it's something that I tried to think a lot about, but it is hard. I mean, the only thing that I try to do that's my main way of telling if the pacing is right is just to try as hard as much as I can to imagine the reader, you know, which is a big act of the imagination, to pretend that this is not my book and instead I'm reading, you know, say someone else's work, but to try to put myself in the reader's position and have a sense from that, you know, how long is too long for a scene, you know, how fast do I need to move the story. So that, I mean, that was, I tried to pace it in the way that I as a reader would appreciate, you know, at a fast enough level, but still hopefully with time for characters to develop and there to be sort of time to kind of, develop the different themes. But that is one of the trickiest things. It's so interesting, though, that you connected it with the pace of life, how the pace of life changes for the real-timers especially. You know, what happens is once the slowing starts, the 24-hour day, as you know, no longer corresponds to our clocks. So most people choose to stay on the clocks anyway, as the government sort of suggests or demands. But the real-timers refuse to do that because you become completely out of sync with day and night. So the real-timers are living by the rising and setting of the sun, even though those days are getting longer and longer. And it was really kind of fascinating to imagine how your life might change, you know.
I would think so.
Yeah, because especially, you know, we're so used to the 24-hour clock, and also I think many of us feel like there's not enough time in the day. So to imagine these kind of longer, slower days was interesting.
Well, right. Plus you have the sense of time that an 11-year-old girl would have is very different, maybe, than the sense of time you have as an adult or
you're right,
you know,
for
a very
sure.
busy industrialist or something like that. You know, you just look at it differently.
It's true, and I think...
You know, you remember how long days are when you're a child.
Yeah.
They're not 72 hours, but sometimes they feel like they're 72 hours.
Yeah, and as children, and I think this happens in the book, you know, you can become good friends with someone very quickly, and as if you've had more time together than you really have, you know?
Right, right. It's interesting. So tell us a little bit about the science of the thing. Are you a natural science buff? Were you in you know, physics club when you were in high school and that kind of thing?
I was not in physics club.
That's too bad.
You know, I was never. I never studied science. That was never my sort of strength. I mean, I was always more on the writing and language and book side. But I always have loved to read about science as kind of a layperson. You know, the science section of the newspaper is my favorite section, and I love to read about, you know, when scientists think they've discovered a new planet or a new asteroid. You know, I'm always really interested in those stories, or a new species that we didn't know that lives at the bottom of the ocean, or something like that. You know, I'm always really fascinated by all those stories, and I think it's because I just love how science is about. Just trying to map our world, you know, we're always getting, through science, getting a better and better understanding of what the world, what there is in the world and in the universe. So I've always been drawn to that, but it was never my strength. So, like I said, this book grew out of hearing this fascinating scientific detail about the rotation of the Earth. And then after that, I tried to do research. I mean, I did do research as I wrote the story, but I tried to I didn't want to load it down with scientific research, but it was very important to me that it feel real, because I felt like if the reader doesn't believe the situation, if the science doesn't seem real to the reader, then you won't be concerned about the people. And that was my primary concern, was to make sure that you felt like these are real people going through a real crisis.
And it could have been plausible, even though it's fiction.
Right.
Could have been. Who's to say?
Yeah, I mean, so I did all kinds of research, and some of it was accidental. Like if I just came across a story about human circadian rhythms, and how our sleep patterns work, or mysterious extinction of a species, or extreme weather, all those things. If there was anything I could learn from that story in our real world that applied to my book, I would sort of add that detail and drop it in.
Did you ever feel sort of overwhelmed by some of the research? Because it seems like, I'm a liberal arts person myself, and if I were to sort of turn one day and say, okay, I'm going to learn about astrophysics so I can write this book, I think I would, claw my eyes out. But how do you sort of get past that initial fear that we liberal scientists have about that?
Yeah, it was hard. One of the hardest things was, at one point I came across the fact that the rotation of the Earth is involved in the generation of the magnetic field, which protects us from radiation from space, and some of the sun's radiation. So that was a detail that I came across somewhere, and then I tried to imagine through the research what would happen to the magnetic field if the rotation of the Earth slowed down. And when I get excited as a fiction writer is when I come across I'll come across something in science where the scientists say, we still don't totally understand, X, Y, Z, because then that helps me feel like I have a little bit of space for the imagination.
Right. Get your toe in the door on that one.
Yeah, so the magnetic field is one of those things that scientists say they don't fully understand that process of how they know it's related. The turning of the Earth is related to the magnetic field, but there's still some murkiness about exactly what the connection is. And anyway, there's to me a space. There's a space for scientists and a space for fiction writers, because scientists, I'm sure, are working on trying to solve that puzzle and figure it out. But for me, it gave me a certain license, which I think for me, for this book, it was important to write about a situation that no one expects to happen, and so no one knows for certain exactly everything that would happen.
Sure.
Certainly, astrophysicists, one of whom I showed the book to, have they can have an idea of what would happen. And so after I sold my book, I finally worked up the nerve to have an astrophysicist read it, which was scary. And the reason I didn't have someone read it earlier was just because I felt this feeling like I knew how hard it was to publish a book, and I just had no idea if this book would ever get published, and I didn't want to waste a scientist's time. Yeah, and use his time, right? So use his or her time. So anyway, I showed it to an astrophysicist, and he was really great, and mostly I was relieved by how much of it he felt was plausible, and then he helped me fix a few things that I had misunderstood. And then, of course, as a fiction writer, I was happy to take a few liberties. So
seems fair to me. Why would you write fiction? So I understand that, and you come away from those kinds of research periods with sort of finite information, definitions that you can work with, or that that you can adjust a little bit to have your own point of view. What about the psychological? How did you get to the sickness, the syndrome?
Right. Well, some of the psychological things, I did a little bit of research about that, like how sleep deprivation might affect people, but a lot of that is, just as a human being, in a way, I've been doing research for my whole life, on what it's like to be a person, and to have relationships with other people, and watching how other people react in all the various ways that humans react to crises.
Right.
So those kinds of things, just as a writer, every time you sit down to write anything, even when it is just straight realism and doesn't have this big extraordinary crisis, you're always trying to imagine and give life to, and make make the people seem real and make the psychology seem real. So it was.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know if you unearthed anything that talked about what the effect of something like that might look like or be, sort of.
Well, I did some research about people who live in above the Arctic Circle because
In the darkness.
yeah, because in the book, as the nights get very long and the days get very long, and the closest thing I could imagine or I knew of in our real world to that type of life was people who really do live above the Arctic Circle, so that in the winter
Right.
they have darkness for 24 hours or longer, and then in the summer they have light all the time. So I did a little bit of research about that, and I read a study that said that suicide rates are slightly higher in above the Arctic Circle, and especially in the summer. And I thought that was interesting because you'd think maybe, or I would think maybe, and this is a detail I put in the book, I would think that long periods of darkness would be harder on the
so,
psyche,
too.
but there was something about there was an increased, I think some increased depression, but for sure increased impulsiveness for some reason when in those long periods of daylight. And so that was a detail that I read in the newspaper and then put into my book.
And that was important to her father because he sort of bowed to his impulses.
Yeah, that's true. He does become more impulsive. Yeah,
He gets a little bit off perhaps his normal behavior.
Yeah, but that was a detail that that I got from this one study that said they found more impulsiveness in times of prolonged daylight, and so I imagined my characters during the prolonged daylight that they face. I imagined that maybe they would be more impulsive too.
Makes sense. So how you're very young. How much of your life is bound up in this book? How long did it take you?
Well, I started the short story when I was in graduate school in 2004 or 5, right after that piece of news I read. And it was just kind of an experiment, and I set it aside for a few years. And then I started working in book publishing, and then I came back to that story and decided to try to turn it into a novel. And so from that point, when I started trying to turn it into a novel to when I finished it was about 4 years. So.
And you wrote on it every day? I read something that you wrote on the subway.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well,
it's kind of interesting.
I had a full-time job as a book editor in New York, and it was a great job, but I started as an editorial assistant, kind of worked my way up, but you don't have very much free time because you spend all day, answering phones and having meetings and writing jacket copy and stuff, but then you're expected at night and on the weekends to be reading manuscripts, other people's manuscripts, and deciding which ones to publish, and also, editing the ones that you already know you are going to publish. So I had hardly any free time during that time. So the only time that I could find really was before I went to work in the morning. And it wasn't very much time. It was about an hour every day. Or sometimes half an hour. So it really was a book that I wrote, minute by minute. And sometimes I would bring my laptop on the subway, and that was for 2 reasons. One, sometimes it was if I'd had a really great writing morning, and I wished I could keep writing instead of leaving for work, but I had to leave. So I brought my laptop to try to finish my thoughts. But other times it might be because I slept in. I slept in plenty of days. I was, but then I would be kind of annoyed at myself, and I would think, well, I'll just bring my laptop, and at least I'll write for 20 minutes on the train. Because it really bothered me if a day went by when I didn't do any work on it. That made me feel like I was never going to finish the book. So as long as I wrote for 20 minutes or an hour a day, it felt like slowly but surely I'll eventually finish it.
So, it's interesting that you bring that up. The whole thing is about time, and even in the writing of it, you were very aware of time and making sure that you assigned the time and all that.
It's true,
it's kind
yeah.
of crazy.
I know, sometimes I think about, was there something psychologically going on that in a time when I felt like I didn't have enough hours in the day, that then I invented this story in which the days actually literally grew. I don't know.
Well, that seems fair. That seems like one approach, at least. What do you think was the hardest part of telling us this story? Was there a point where you just really got stuck and you said, "Oh, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. I have to cogitate on this a little while."
Well, the ending was very hard to figure out. It was hard to decide sort of where to leave the story. So yeah, that was probably one of the hardest things. And I had set up a sort of a challenge for myself, which I didn't realize, because at the very beginning, the first time I wrote the short story, the first page I wrote, I had this voice that was an adult looking back on childhood. And I wanted that. I also wanted that voice because I wanted to be able to have access to an adult's, thinking and perspective, even though I was writing about childhood. But that gap between when the action of the story happens, where she's a child, and the time it's taken for her to grow up and be able to tell this story, it opened up this kind of just technical challenge for me, because I was imagining the book as like this 1 year in her life, but then of course you want to know what happened all the time since.
Of course.
So it was a hard thing to figure out how to manage that.
Did you decide to make her father an obstetrician as a sense of irony?
Oh.
I mean, sort of a birth, rebirth kind of thing? Or did you just pull it out of the air?
I mean, I pictured him to be sort of a solid person and I like to say to him being a doctor. I don't know why I chose for him to be an obstetrician. I mean, I think there's something so primal about that, even though it's just a profession. It's one of the professions we have. It's a job. But then again, it is like what's more sort of fundamental than that. The beginnings of human lives are happening every day at this person's job. So there was something appealing about including that, even just as a small detail in the book.
Well, and you could go back there and look at cycles and returns and timing as well.
You're right,
It's a 9-month job.
Yeah.
And you're seldom on the clock. It just sort of happens as well.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, I think you're right also that, writing a book about where human life is sort of under threat, they don't know what's going to happen, then I think Julia's youth is sort of extra poignant in that world, but also the idea of babies being born is also, they're being born in, what kind of world are they being born into? There's sort of something interesting about that, I thought.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there are all kinds of themes that we have not explored. There are all kinds of ideas that are in the story that are really intriguing and very thoughtful. I was really taken by the number of ideas and questions that came up in really a pretty short novel.
Oh yeah.
It's a pretty short novel. So that was interesting. But I want to leave a lot of space for other people to have questions. I don't want to ask you all the questions.
Okay.
I want people to have an opportunity to voice their own questions and come to Karen with whatever points you would like to make. Do we have some questions from the audience? Coming right up.
And thank you so much for being here. I'm just so glad, and thank you for having me.
Oh, we're delighted. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay. Here's a very basic question.
Okay.
Just how did Julia get to be 23 years old? It seems that everything was dying, food, etc., and that humans would die too. How did she survive?
Well, I think the focus of the book, like I said, I liked this idea that she's sitting down to write, the story of sort of the first year that this news was coming out. And so the book doesn't go into a lot of detail about what has happened since, but I guess I imagined that even though life has gotten much harder and there's been a lot of damage to the planet, humans are very adaptable and resilient, and that they would, until human life is literally impossible, they would, a certain number of people would remain. So in my mind, it was that it hadn't quite, things are dire, but people are still managing to survive, but they just don't know what lies ahead. So
there you go. I'm interested in this one. This individual says, in one group I was in, someone read a review saying that this should have been a YA book, a young adult book, and this individual disagreed. Did you think of it as a YA title? If so, why or not?
I thought of it as an adult book, and it was published as an adult book. And most of my expertise is in adult book. The books that I read have mostly been adult books. And I love stories that are adults. I think I already mentioned this, but adults looking back on childhood, because then inherently it's about being a child and being an adult, at the same time. And every adult has been a child. So I was imagining adult readers, but it's been really kind of exciting to find that younger readers are responding to it, and it makes sense because it's so much about adolescence. And then I guess the other thing is that's interesting. I mean, I've learned more about the YA genre since I published this book, and I think it's so interesting because it's hard to exactly decide what it even means, because I think
I'm with you. I know.
I think originally it meant literally a book that is only meant for teenagers or younger or kids. But now I think it means something different, because there's it does mean that, but there's so many adults who love to read YA, and they say, like, I love to read YA, like YA is my favorite genre, and so then they're not younger readers. So it's just kind of fascinating to me to figure out, is it just any book that has to do with childhood, or anyway?
Could be.
But I'm
could
open.
Be for young adults or about young adults or whatever.
So I should probably read more YA books. But
have you had a lot of reaction from young adults?
I have, yeah.
And how have they greeted the book? Did they find that it was motivational to them? Did they find that they were despairing when they read it, or were they just questioning?
I found that the adults find it much more, much sadder, more melancholy than the kids. I think kids, in a way, that's how Julia is too. Like, maybe you just don't have as much perspective when you're so young. You can't.
Maybe.
It's just, I don't know what it is, but they're wrapped up in the story and they're interested, and they find it less. Yeah, they're not as saddened by
it. Here's a question you must have known that you would get when you came back to Southern California. It's actually, I'm going to wrap two here, questions together. Is there a plan for the movie? You knew you'd get that here, right? And when can we expect to see your next work?
Well, I did option the movie rights to a company called River Road, which I was very excited about. And they did Brokeback Mountain and The Tree of Life and a couple of other sort of, artistic movies. So they're working on it. They have a script and they're looking for a director. And so I'm hoping that it happens. I mean, I know that Hollywood is such a crazy place, and a lot of times a book gets options or the movie rights are sold, and then it never gets made into a movie, or it takes 15 years, so who knows. But they're working on it, and it seems to be moving in the right direction, so crossing my fingers. I think it would be exciting to see it as a movie, yeah.
So what about the second book?
And I am working on a new book. I'm still in the relatively early stages, and I feel a little superstitious about saying too much about it. But I guess what I've been saying is that it is like The Age of Miracles. It's another story about ordinary people facing a really extreme situation, but just a different kind of situation.
We'll just wait and see it when it comes out. One of our participants is interested in your career as an editor. Your book career and how that might have influenced your writing, if you think it did.
Yeah, I think it definitely influenced me. I know that it made me a better writer, and I think that's because it made me...
Just because you had to read so carefully?
Yeah, because it made me a better reader, and so part of learning to be an editor was learning to figure out, and I had some really great, mentors. My bosses were, especially the first one I worked with, he was a very good editor and very thorough, and so during the time I worked with him, and as I became an editor, I was learning to figure out on a really close level, what makes for a clear sentence, what's a confusing sentence, what's the right pacing, for a chapter or for a whole novel, or what's the kind of thing that a reader starts to feel like is too slow or confusing, or what makes for a believable character. Like, all of those things were things I had to learn as an editor, and had to try to help authors when I detected something was wrong. I had to sort of help them figure out how to fix it. And so all those lessons I was learning at work, I definitely took home and applied to my own writing. And I tried to imagine when I was writing this book that I was also editing it. You know, I would try to look at it with my editor's eyes, and of course, that's an act of the imagination. You know, you can never, it can never be quite the same, but I think it definitely helped me, for sure. It made me a better writer.
It would make it much more difficult, it seems to me, because you're really sort of writing and judging and rejudging and rewriting and.
Yeah, you know, a lot of writers find that to be a paralyzing process. You know, the revising and being critical of your own work. It can be harmful to a lot of writers, especially while they're trying to be creative and write. But for me, it's a very enjoyable process. You know, it's like polishing something. You know, just making it as perfect as possible. I enjoy it. So I like to edit as I write my sentences.
Then it takes a very long time to get something written.
It's true. It does. It makes me a slow writer, I think.
That's okay. Just two more questions. Talk to us a little bit about the books that have inspired you. What kind of books really light up your face?
Well, my favorite books are books that where there's something really interesting going on with the writing. You know, where the writing is very beautiful or very stylish, and you know, attention has been paid to the kind of language that the writer is using. But so they have that element, but also some kind of gripping story. You know, I find those are my favorite when those two things come together. So some of my favorites are Blindness by Jose Saramago, which is about a city that has this mysterious epidemic of blindness. The Road by Cormac McCarthy, it's probably that you probably might be more familiar with. The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides, which I loved, and I love how he writes about youth in this an ordinary suburban life in this really beautiful way. And that one definitely helped inspire me to write my book, because it was like he found this way to talk about ordinary suburban childhood, but because it has these dramatic deaths, those ordinary things are thrown into relief and become, I think, more meaningful, or it makes you realize the meaning. So those are some of my favorites. Marilyn Robinson is another one of my favorites.
Yeah, she's good. Okay, one last piece of advice that our audience is asking for. Your advice for aspiring novelists trying to make it in a declining, slowly revolving public climate. In other words, I think they're talking about the fact that, you know, publishing itself has changed so much. So what's the advice for the next group?
I mean, I don't know. Definitely the knowledge that it's going to be a hard road is probably one of the most valuable things to have. And that's one thing that I did have, you know. When I first started working in book publishing, it was kind of discouraging to see all these novels come across people's desks that you know that someone spent, you know, years on that, and an editor might read it and think like, oh, this person is a really good writer, but this book just doesn't work, and then that's it, and it's done. It was years of that person's life, and they had some talent, you know. So
that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it was. So it was hard, but I think I sort of, once I got over that, then I had a thicker skin about that, and I also had really low expectations, which is sort of sad, I guess, but it makes it so that I was, you know, kind of convinced I would not publish this book, and I was just like, well, maybe if I could just publish it somewhere, if just one editor takes a chance on it, I'll be happy. So anyway, so that was good. I mean, I think the most useful advice I ever got, which I try to repeat, is to just try to think of your writing career as separate from your publishing career, because you know, you have better control over your writing, you know, like just getting up every day and working on the writing and making the writing as good as it can be, making the book as good as it can be before you try to publish it, and just to try to get sort of daily pleasure, if you can, out of the writing itself, because there could be, in ways that are good and bad, the publishing world is just crazy. I mean, like, you know, there can be a lot of disappointments, and it's nice if you can keep them separate, I think.
But you're one of a long string of authors who have said the best way to write is just to continue to write. Just write and write and write. I think that's important.
Another good piece of advice I got was when I was in college. It was from the writer Amy Bender. She was a teacher of mine at UCLA and was great. And she had this idea. She encouraged us to submit our short stories to journals right away, like even though we were young. And I mean, I think about it now. I wonder if she sort of knew we weren't ready, like we weren't going to publish these stories. I mean, I don't know if she thought that or not, but I feel like we were years away from publishing the stories. But she had this sort of advice that, like, you don't have to be in charge of when that's going to happen. Like, you just keep writing and keep getting better, and you're going to you send your stories out, and then one day, and that was her experience. Like, after years, a few in sort of quick succession for her started to get accepted places, and I think that's true too. The more you write, the better you get at it, and then someday, if you just keep at it, you'll have the better the book is, the better the chance that someone will publish it. But there might be a lot of no's before.
That makes wonderful pragmatic sense. A very good approach, I think, for any of us. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for sharing
I'm really
your
honored.
evening with us. It's been great fun. So let's thank Karen again.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
And she has graciously agreed to be seated at the table here to my right. If you have a copy of her book that you would like for her to inscribe. So she will be at that table waiting for you if you would like for that to happen. So thank you again for coming. Thank you for your support for One City, One Story. And as our friend Mr. Tornick said, thank you for your continued support of the Pasadena Public Library. We love being here and working with you. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.